This is the second lecture for chapters 7 through 9, and we're continuing looking at the interactions in species. So I have this little comparative up here. It's a little better once I get all the little smiley faces in here. All right, so just looking at some comparisons, and these are mostly like definition vocab stuff. Amensalism, you're kind of looking at it as far as one species compared to another. This kind of straight face means it doesn't really matter. They don't really care one way or the other for certain plants. The other species actually is having harm done to it. So for example, cattle and grass. Cattle just moving one place to another. It's just not necessarily benefiting or having any harm done. Where the grass, of course, is being trampled and does not necessarily appreciate that. Commensalism, if we're focusing on the remora. Remoras are small little fish that kind of hang out away from the mouth. Sometimes actually they will go in and clean the teeth of a shark. And they, of course, benefit by this. The shark, for the most part, just doesn't really care. It's just kind of there. And the remora is benefiting by living by a shark, and it picks up the scraps. Competition, we can look at for a couple different perspectives, but we're going to focus on this one here for predator and prey. Predators are very happy when they catch prey. Prey, not so much. Mutualism is where species both benefit because of the interaction. Now, a little misconception on that is that they kind of get along and they do this now knowingly. No, it just happens to work out that way, that they both benefit. But they don't like make an agreement. You do this and I'll do that and everything will be great. It just so happens to work out that way. Another one just to mention as far as the competition is parasitism, where you have one species which is, of course, benefiting and another one not so much. And this is a good example of a lake trout, which of course have been very much decimated in our Great Lakes because of the sea lamprey, which is invasive. It does harm to lake trout. This is always like kind of gross, and this is a potential problem we have in our Great Lakes. All right, changing the conversation a little bit, looking at succession. There's two different ways that we can actually look at this, primary and secondary. Primary means you're starting with rock. Think of a location that's nothing's ever grown there before, new conditions. And the best example of that would be like after a volcano, Mount St. Helens type scenario where everything is just wiped out and you're starting from new. Or if you go way back, you can think of glaciers, scraping out and clearing the land, and it's all brand new. Secondary, think of that from like clear cutting a location. And one of the classic examples that College Board likes to refer to is New England. It comes up time and again. Where New England, if you are anywhere driving around out in the country area, you may see these forests that look like they've been there forever. But of course they haven't. Once upon a time, people completely cleared the land of everything that was there and they farmed there for generations and generations. And then eventually people moved further west and the land was allowed to go back to its natural conditions, and it went through succession. Species will go through a series of changes, and I think I have a slide over here. I do. And if you're looking at how a location will change, primary and secondary kind of resemble something similar, except that in a secondary, and I'll show this on the next slide, it looks more so kind of like this starting off, where something's already been there in the past, and now it's gone through some changes. So let me go back to here, and you can kind of see on the secondary where you do have some things after, for example, like a clear cutting, and then you have certain types of species that pioneer a location. So like, for example, like weeds that do really well in poor conditions but high sunlight, and then eventually other species will move in and start replacing them. What's quite interesting when you think of trees, there are certain trees that come in first and will establish a location as a forest. But then under that shade, other types of trees, in this example, oak hickory, they require shade to grow. So they will grow underneath the shade of other trees like poplars and aspens. And then over a period of time, they will outgrow in height the aspen and the poplar trees and then crowd them out if everything is left alone. And then giving it 100, 150, 200 years, the forest will now be an oak hickory forest whereas they actually needed other tree species to establish that location. Kind of interesting. Get rid of this and move on. And this is a good point to make. Is succession a guaranteed process? No. So one of our potential problems we have out there that isn't thought through really well is the tropical rainforest in, say, for example, the Amazon. Most of the biomass or the nutrients are above ground because the growing conditions are just so good all year round that stuff grows and it's above ground. So all the nutrients are in the trees and the biomass. So when you clear the land and remove or burn it and you remove all this material and you try to grow crops there, it's only good for just a couple of seasons. After that, most of the nutrients have been removed from the ground and stuff does not grow well. Crops do not grow well. And then therefore you have to move on to a new location. We are seeing this happen in the Amazon right now. So what determines the stability and sustainability? The amount of interactions you have in a location. Easy enough. And looking at this as far as us removing species or just changing the conditions that are within a particular location can have impacts on the types of things that normally would be sustainable and go on for a longer period of time. We are changing those conditions in a variety of locations. Okay, this is starting to get close to human population. Looking at this, as far as this is fairly straightforward, but there's 4 factors, and you can see them there, the changes to any population over a period of time. Clearly, births and deaths, that's pretty straightforward. Immigration into a location and emigration, leaving a location, all this affects the total numbers. These are some of the conditions that will affect how a population will change over time. And sometimes we will focus on one particular group, the reproductive age, but really the main focus that you want to look at is the pre-reproductive age. Those are the individuals that will influence the future. Okay, a couple of more vocab words, and we'll see how they kind of relate. There are 2 factors that allow populations to grow or not to grow. Intrinsic rate of increase, that's the factors that are allowing a population to grow. And some species strategize in a way that allows their populations to explode or do well. And other species do things more on the slower side with a higher rate of success, carrying capacity, K. And so it's just different strategies to succeed. And these are some of the factors that kind of go into it. We'll just put them all up here. I think that's all of them. And try to think of humans as far as where we might fit into this conversation. Now, if you look at lifespan, so some things live for a very short period of time. Think insects. Some things live for a very long period of time. Think, bears or turtles, a variety of things. Of course, humans are in the conversation. Time to reproduce for reproductive maturity. Some things can reproduce at a very early age. Other things need years and years, tens of years sometimes. Think like whales. Reproductive events. Sometimes things will go through many mating seasons. Others, maybe just a few times in their lifespans. Offspring, you can kind of go through some of these and just make the comparison. I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but we do see how they vary. The population regulation, I will mention that one. Some species, regardless of the amount of food, because they do things so quickly, their populations can explode, but then they crash as a result. Where if you do things more slowly, population regulation, they are density dependent. So the location will only support so many individuals based on that population. And it's kind of just predictable as far as the numbers we have. If you go back to R selected, they don't necessarily need that. They will just go on running. And as far as the dynamics, you can again see or the R selected species, they're highly variable. Their numbers can be very quite different. And then, of course, case selected, they're very stable. Once they get to that carrying capacity, the number of individuals that location can support, it typically stays right about there. It doesn't change a whole lot. All right, this is a pretty good place to pause.